Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Captive Audience. Don Henderson here and Sonny Danforth. Say good evening, Sonny.
Well, good evening, everybody. It's
All
good to
right.
be back in Oregon here.
Yeah, she was down in Florida, sunning and funning. So we're a little jealous, but welcome back anyway.
Well, thank you. It's always good to be back home and sleep in your own bed, right?
Right. Oh, absolutely. At the end of the day, that's the best. But man, I was very jealous of you being in Florida. That just sounds like uh, just sounds like paradise. Although our weather's finally changing here, so maybe it's Florida-like, right?
Yeah, so well, it's not quite Florida-like, but it's getting there. It is so beautiful over here. I'm telling you. I was happy to see that the dogwood trees were still in bloom when I got back, and it's just anyway, it's beautiful. Beautiful area where we are.
Yeah, we live in a tremendous place. Communist though it may be, although where you are isn't. So so there's that.
No, it isn't, but we still get the remnants.
Yeah, yeah.
You know,
Mm,
I
you
mean,
can't help it.
no, and sadly we can't.
Yeah. But anyway, so I thought we launched right in. Before we started this call, Sunday and I were talking about some of the developments in China, and I just sent you all a link in the chat to take a look at. And that's a Substack that I wrote about the Soviet Union and CCP. I entitled it "Deja Vu All Over Again," because that's exactly what it feels like. And for those of you, and I think most of us are old enough to remember what it was like when the Soviet Union was in play and the Cold War was going. I'll never forget, I had a Russian professor tell me back in the early 80s that China is going to, the Soviet Union is going to collapse. It's not sustainable what they're doing. The
Mhm.
press was all talking about how big and bad the Soviet Union was. It was never going to fail because, of course, all good communists and the leftist press never talk about bad things about communism. They're always propping these countries up. And the next thing you know, and that professor predicted it would fall by 1990. And of course, we all know the end of the story. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1989. He was spot on, and the reason was because they could not keep up economically, being pushed by Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, and the SDI and all of those things caused its collapse. So, what I theorize in this post that I've written that you will all see is that we're looking at probably the same process with the CCP. Don't know if it's going to collapse just from this, and no one knows for sure. But I think that what SDI was to Ronald Reagan, the tariffs are to Trump. And so I'll stop there. And your commentary, your thoughts, Sonny?
Well, I agree with you actually. See, over in China, things are not it's not harmonious, I'll say. And
Mhm.
I did see I didn't read the article, but I saw a headline of some top military person has been disappeared. And so that's not a good sign. And then I'm going to post a link here to an article from the Epic Times that says China's six biggest banks report $1 billion profit drop.
Wow.
And it wasn't very long ago. I don't know, maybe at the most 2 years ago, that the largest contractors developers in China, three top largest contractors, all filed bankruptcy. And and I think your Substack, your dad's rants that you wrote on this, it was absolutely spot on.
Yeah. It's incredibly fake. If you just tell one thing to realize, communist governments always lie. You cannot believe what they say. And remember, they don't operate by what do they call it? The GAP standards. So, generally accepted accounting principles are what they're called, right?
Hmm.
So you can't count on any numbers that come out of there. That's one of the reasons why the best personal, what do you call it, professional financial advisors will never recommend a stock out of China unless it adheres to the GAP. And there's only a couple of them that do. The rest of them don't. So whatever data you're getting, you have no idea what really is underlying that. And sooner or later, that house of cards will fall. And you take a look at something like this. Yes, China is the second biggest country in the world by GDP, but that's not the number that matters. What really matters is what's your GDP per capita. And their GDP per capita is like $13,000, a year, versus the average United States is around 87,000 a year. So think about that. And only 14% of the population in China makes over that $13,000 a year, or gets over $13,000. That means 85% of the population is in grinding poverty. That's like zero middle class. And a country without a middle class is just unsustainable.
Well, it is. And, people are out in the streets protesting over there right now. And if you aren't looking at some alternate media, you would never know it
Oh,
because the so called legacy media isn't going to tell you anything. So they've actually stopped the economic reporting from China later today. They
wow.
said we're not going to give any information. Well, how is that? You know, it's
that
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 bad.
tells you is that bad.
It's that bad. And so their banks are their revenues down, their profits are down, and this is in the first quarter. The first quarter of this year, things are not looking good. And their construction bank reported uh, their revenue is down by over 5%, like almost 5.5%. So economically, things it's a paper tiger. Their economy and actually they are coming to the table to talk tariffs. I don't care what their media says. Oh no, they're not. Oh yes, they are.
No,
Their ships are out there in the ocean swirling, hoping to come into port because
they're
they need our economy. They need us buying stuff.
no, their press lies like a rug. And what they must do, they've got to save face, and it wouldn't do them to say. They've been telling their own people for decades that they're the best, that they're winning, that they're crushing the United States. They can turn around now and say they got to come to us with hat in hand, but that's precisely what they're doing. And you'll see the last. I clicked instead another article. If we all look at China erupts, furious workers riot as factories collapse. There's rioting and people protesting the streets, and this isn't communist China, where if they see your face and there's cameras everywhere, you're done. So you think about the level of courage it takes for these young people to go out in the streets and protest when the likelihood of you disappearing is like beyond high. It's got to be pretty bad for that to happen. But that's what's going on. So Trump has these people exactly where he wants them, and I truly believe this from a global. Think about this like remember Henry Kissinger. He talked about realpolitik, right?
Hmm.
You can't come and say in public that your goal is to cause the government to collapse of your adversary, right? But I think the goal of the Trump administration is the collapse of our adversary. Just like Reagan couldn't come out and say the same thing about Gorbachev, but that was the goal. You notice I said the government, not the people, but the government that is enslaving its citizens. We have basically a situation where maybe what? The top 10 million people, maybe like 5% of the elite are ruling over the other 900 million and treating them like slaves. That's essentially what's happening. So hopefully this causes, I think the best thing that could happen for them is the old Ceausescu moment. Maybe they'll be lucky enough in his case, he won't go out like Ceausescu. Ceausescu lost his life and his regime. This guy will lose his regime. We'll see.
We will see. And yet this is a country where they have slave labor. There was many talks, many years ago about, oh yeah, the sneakers that you're buying, are all built, manufactured using slave labor. A lot of goods that come to America, it is. And yet, um, even them are maybe they're rioting too out in the streets. They don't make a lot of money. And when you have I don't know, I've never been to China and I don't know the structure, but I have been to Cuba. And Cuba had people of Cuba had their housing was paid for, their utilities were paid for. If they wanted a phone, they had to pay for that themselves. And then they had a coupon book. And the coupon book was to go and stand in line to get your daily ration of a loaf of bread and beans and rice and maybe there was meat. Maybe there was meat. You only got and I know this from talking to Cubans that have lived there, that they would get a pair of shoes a year, a pair of pants a year, and a shirt a year. This is what it's like living in a communist country. Now, I don't know how that is all because in China, and people have had a taste of freedom of having businesses, even though China owns so many of the businesses, maybe the international type. And what about you, Don? Have you ever been to China?
No, I haven't, but I've known a ton of people who are from there, who
Mhm.
experienced life there and who escaped. And everything I hear from them personally dovetails precisely with what you just said. On top of all the things that I've read about life in communist systems, whether you're talking Romania, East Germany, the old Soviet Union, Venezuela, you name the country, it all winds up looking the same because the system is inherently evil and it cannot work. It is basically a method for enslaving people. They tell you that they're going to take care of you, but at the end of the day, the very top, steal, and the last 95% live in like an utter abject poverty. And one of the things that's unique about China is they've learned from the Soviet Union. If you recall, um, Gorbachev realized that this system can't sustain itself. There's no way we can do this. So let's open it up a crack. Let's let in a little business. Let's let in a little information. Remember perestroika? Remember that? And I can't
Mhm.
remember the other term they had. They had glasnost, right? Remember those terms? They did that.
Yes.
The people got to look at some freedom. They got to look at the opportunity to make a little money for themselves. They saw what life was like in the West versus the East, and that was the end of that. China learned from that. They're not making that mistake, and the technology allows them to clamp down on these people even more. There's cameras everywhere. There's facial recognition everywhere. You say something wrong, you lose social media score points, and then you can't go to the store. You can't travel outside town. You can't move around in your own country. You can't
Mhm.
buy stuff. I mean, they have these people in a data-driven, you know, Orwellian scenario that is hard for us to imagine here. But that's where it is. They are utterly enslaved.
You're absolutely right because they have like digital currency. So if you don't do what they want you to do, you're forbidden to purchase, right? Your money's locked up if you have any left. And so, which brings me to two articles and what you were talking about. And one of them is our own talking about being slaves and whatnot. One of them is our own House today voted to it. In fact, overwhelmingly, it was actually bipartisan, voted to pass a bill to counter the CCP's forced organ harvesting. And Representative Chris Smith, who's from New Jersey, had stated, we need a penalty that's commensurate with the crime, and the crime is outrageous. And this is, and so actually only one person vote. Well, I don't know that they voted against it. It was 406 to 1. The one could have been a not a vote. I'm going to guess it was a no vote. I can't imagine anybody not doing that. Well, maybe, let's see, Elon
Yeah,
Omar,
there's probably a few.
but only one voted against this. And this is because in China, you can actually go to China and say, well, I need a kidney transplant. And they go, okay, you know what? They run some tests. They go, oh, yeah, we've got that. And in this article that I just posted there from the Epic Times, they say, sure, we have this inventory. Well, let me tell you, there is no such inventory. They're going out and killing people to harvest that organ and to for a person. That is not how it needs to be, how it should be. You don't kill one for another, but when you're in a country that does not care for their population,
And it's not
and
just any old body either, by the way. For example, I think it's the majority is the Han Chinese, I believe it is. But
yeah,
if you're not the Han Chinese, then you're suitable for this sort of thing to happen to you. And particularly if you happen to be a political dissident and wind up in prison, then you're open for a little organ harvesting. Now, the Uyghurs, that's an ethnic group that resides in
mhm,
China, have been experiencing this, reporting this for years, that they've been like enslaving them, putting them in prison, taking their organs. Some of them get to live, like maybe you lose one kidney and maybe you get to live with the
Mhm.
other one. But there's other who are less fortunate and they lose everything and then they just die. And that's how things run in communist countries.
Yes, absolutely. The Uyghurs, this is what's happened with them, Falun Gong. Um, so they talk about this is a huge scale of people doing this. And I'll tell you, China's not the only country to do this. I know of um, it happening in Central America as well, that people were being abducted and they they wake up and they've got this big cut on them and they're
Mhm.
missing something. They don't even know what's happened to them.
You know,
And
for sure, China's
it's
not the only offender, but it's
no.
probably the only one where it's widespread government policy to do it.
So
Right.
this is fabulous that our House passed this. Now it's got to go to the Senate, right?
Yeah.
But the act passage today is a very good thing, and this is actually a global problem,
Mhm. Yes, it is.
absolute global problem. So um, I like this. Then the other one was, talking about controlling the people. Well, the EU is taking legal action against member states for not enforcing internet policing laws. Well, hello. That type of thing is what happens over in China.
Hmm.
They
Yeah.
are policing themselves and, or I'm sorry, they're not. They are forcing people, like, as you were talking, I was thinking about during COVID how I saw videos of them shutting down, barricading the people inside their apartments that they couldn't come out. They
It was
were welding the doors shut, and I can't imagine that.
Yeah,
I feel
all
for
you
the
could hear
people.
were people screaming. There's your
Yes.
15-minute city. There's the objective of the radical left. They love what they saw in China. So if we can lock down an entire city, have them 100% under our control, then that's the ideal thing for them. I read something. Actually it was a speaker that I listened to, and he had this saying I thought was so apropos. It was like you have to have the capacity to imagine evil. If you think about that, the average Joe doesn't want to believe that stuff. We don't want to think that people can be that evil. And people call you conspiracy theorists and all those kinds of things. But the reality is, we all believe in Jeffrey Dahmer. We know Jeffrey Dahmer existed. Well, what's the difference between Jeffrey Dahmer and Joseph Stalin or Adolf Hitler? The only difference is those other guys were a lot smarter and got a whole bunch more power. Otherwise, they were the same. They were exactly the same. And those people are among us, and they're at the heads of a lot of these countries, particularly the CCP. That is like maybe the evilest regime we've seen since the old Soviet Union. It's terrible what they're doing there. And our press was a shame is our press won't report on it, but they wouldn't report on it back then either.
No, no, the propaganda. It's really not press. That's really not reporting. It's propaganda here in America. And if you're turning your television on and watching that, all the ABC channels, the alphabet channels, I'll say, it truly is propaganda. Even in our house, Newsmax is on often. And this morning, my mother said, they're not even telling you what's going on. All they're doing is covering what's going on. Have we got a pope yet?
Yeah,
I said,
right.
yeah. They're not even them, and I like Newsmax, but they're not telling you what's going on. And so actually, she was watching Fox Business, and Fox Business had Trump on, and some other things that were going on in our country.
Uh-huh.
And you have to search around, because if you don't know how to use a smart TV, then you're kind of stuck, right?
Yeah.
And unless you're on your iPad or on your phone,
Mhm.
looking in X or other sources, looking up in the Epic Times that's covering things, and PJ Media, other ways of getting information.
Yeah, and you got to be a critical thinker too. I think. One of the things that we tried to do with our
Yes.
kids here was, hey, here's that question. Does that make sense? So, just every
Yes.
time you see something, run it through. And even with us, hey, we could be wrong. You ask, does that make sense? Does what they're saying logically flow with what I see around me? And I'll give you a classic example of that. When the whole COVID thing was going down and they were trying our best to say this is the most racist country on earth, I don't need their data. I just walk around my neighborhood, ride my bike, and talk to people. And do I see people getting lynched? Do I see black people hating white people hating black people? Do I see stuff burning down? Nope. Well, I don't believe you because it's not the reality of that I'm living. And I think that goes for lots of stuff that they tell us. You see a lot in your own life that can tell you, and you have a mind, and we just need to learn to use our minds. And you'll see that most of the stuff that they're promulgating is utter nonsense.
No, and in fact, the propaganda is trying to cause the division. That's their goal, is to
That's
keep
what
us
that does.
divided and trying to cause this division. So I would like to go back for a minute to this EU article from the Epoch Times, because imagine that the EU taking legal action against member states not enforcing internet policing law. So they are looking at the EU Commission is to take Czech Republic, Spain, Cyprus, Poland, and Portugal to the Court of Justice
Okay.
for not designating Digital Services Act enforcers. They're going no, So, how much do you think the EU is going to, the citizens that live in these countries are going to tolerate this? And I would love to hear from our audience. Do you think the EU is going to stay together in our lifetimes?
Well, I'll tell you, and here's the thing. Basically, the problem with the EU, it's the same problem we have here, is we've got a bunch of globalist elitists who want to tell everybody else what to do. And one of
Hmm.
the reasons why they're so frustrated here in the United States is we have a populist leader who is saying no. And his opinions are reflective of the majority of the population. And you go out in the in middle America, what we call the flyover states, and they are and have been in agreement with this for a long time. We've had leadership that literally thinks of them as deplorables, as garbage, as stupid. They've been, and the population has been suspicious of this for a long time. It's just nice to have them come along and actually say what they believe. So now you know without a doubt that that's what they believe. And it's the same thing is true in these other European countries. Brussels, the Davos crowd, they hate them. Just like the Northeast elite and the West Coast elite here, they hate the rest of the country. They don't believe in nationalism. Their
Hmm.
nationalism is their peers. So the people of Brussels, they have a lot more in common with the people of Palos Verdes or the people of Lake Oswego. I mean, that's how they think. They don't have anything in common with the people that might live in the center of the state. Take like a Pendleton, for example. They don't care about them. If you don't have the right degrees from the right universities, and think the right things and have the right money, then you are a nobody. And the general population senses this. This is one of the reasons why you have the same thing that happened in the United States happening all over Western Europe. Look what the French government's doing to Marine Le Pen, for example. Looks like
Yes.
she was going to win the election. I think I just sent a link to that article here too. And so what did they do? They filed a bunch of charges against her and took her off the ballot. Does that sound familiar? you know,
Yes,
and
we've
the same
seen
thing
that
is happening.
playbook before.
Yeah, we know that playbook. So they're just playing that playbook all over Europe to keep the general population away from uh, reflecting the will of the people so they can rule from the top. That's the beast. That's the enemy within. That's what we face. And probably a bigger enemy than China, to my mind. We'll defeat any exterior foe. It's the enemy within that's our challenge.
Well, that is our challenge, and speaking of that, there is it's I was reading an article the other day about how the Muslims are targeting Florida and Texas and building a lot of mosques. And right now in Texas, that's been all over in the media that I have seen, not the propaganda media, the alternate, about the city, a Muslim city that's being built, and they want to rule it with Sharia law. Well, the Attorney General Ken Paxton has says, no, no, no. No, no, no. We are not doing Sharia law in Texas. And so he's launched an investigation into that. And this is you. We do have to be vigilant. And does it mean all Muslims are bad? No, I don't think so. But I think there are those that are.
Mhm. Well, here's the thing. It's tough because we are a one of the most difficult things about Judeo-Christianity is we're taught to be kind. And the problem with being kind is you don't want to hurt anybody's feelings, but you can't have a discussion about anything that's important without stepping on some toes, without getting your feelings hurt, without having somebody question your position, and you being, maybe that person has a point. That's a difficult thing, and that's we are taken advantage of for that very reason. So here's the thing: not every civilization is equal. I'm sorry, they're just not. If you look at the civilizations that have done well versus the ones that have not done well, because they behave differently. This is one of the reasons why every country that's ever existed has borders, enforces those borders, has an immigration policy, and is smart enough to not allow too many people in at a time because they don't have an opportunity to assimilate. And we've just
Mhm.
let 20 million people just walk in. Legally, we let in, I think, somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 to 2 million a year, which is a lot. That's a lot more than any other place on the planet. And then
Yeah.
this clown we just had for a president, let like 20 or 30 million people unvetted just walk across the border. How in the world are you supposed to absorb that? Well, what happens is you wind up with a situation like it had in that little town in Ohio. I can't think of the name of it, where a third of the town became Haitian overnight, and that's
Yes.
not going to work. Um, it's just
No, it
not going to
isn't.
work. Yeah. And the thing is, the people who do these things to us, the residents of Tiburon and Lake Oswego and Bellevue and Palos Verdes, they never have to live with the consequences of what they do. Because those people, where they put these people, well, they put them in like East LA or Southeast Portland or South Seattle, where they never have to see them or deal with them. That was, I hate to say it, it sounds terrible, but that was the beauty of the fire event that happened in Southern California. They finally got a taste of the blowback from their own policies. Um,
Well, they did. And also, you recall when the shipment of illegals got dropped off at Martha's Vineyard, it was like, oh no, those people had them out in 24
oh,
hours. You know, they
I think
went,
it's
no,
24
we don't
minutes.
have housing for them here.
I think it's 24 minutes. And they all live behind gates. It's gates for me, but not for thee. Guns for
Yeah.
me, but not for thee. They always have gated communities. They always have guards. Those guards are armed. They never have to deal with the consequences of their policies. It's the lower classes that always get hammered by their policies first. The very ones they say they're here to help, which is the biggest lie ever. Communism sells. That's how it sold itself. We're here to make
Mhm.
society. We're here for you. We're here for the little guy. And then what happens? The little guy's the first one to die.
Yes. So, hey, speaking of illegals, what this has also done is brought a lot more drugs, right? A lot more drugs across the border. Well, the largest fentanyl bust in DEA history happened, I think, yesterday, and today they're writing all about it. Did you hear about that, Don?
No, I did not read it. I saw it, but there's so much stuff, right?
I know there
Yeah.
is, but this is the thing is the bust happened in Salem, Oregon.
Is that right?
Yes, there, but it wasn't just in Salem. It was actually involved 5 states. But in Salem, right, not too far from where our illustrious governor is, and it was the largest drug seizure by the DEA. They got 16 people. They arrested 16 people, seized record breaking quantities of fentanyl, cash, firearms, vehicles across 5 states, dismantling one of the largest and most dangerous drug trafficking organizations in U.S. history. And it was all against the Sinaloa cartel. This is big news. And so in the Statesman's Journal, they're saying 36-year-old Salem man, and throughout the article it just keeps talking about the Salem man, kind of like we're going to make a Maryland man here, you
Yes.
know
That's
in the
another one of
media.
the classic strategies, right? They
Yes.
always lie
So
about the who done it thing, right?
yes, so I'm not going to quote that article anymore, but I wanted to tell you the contrast because in the Elkhorn Media Group, they're not talking about that. They're talking about Albuquerque. So it was in Albuquerque, New Mexico, Salem, Oregon, and let me get this. Salem, Oregon, they got more than $2.8 million in cash, $50,000 in jewelry, about $150,000 in uh, vehicles, and let's see the whole thing. Then they got Layton, Utah, Phoenix, Arizona, and Las Vegas, Nevada. And of those, in those, the whole thing all together, they've got. Let me read where it is. They got 4 million. They recovered more than 4 million of fentanyl laced pills. Total 4.5 million in cash, 79 pounds of meth, 4.5 kilos of heroin, 7.5 kilos of cocaine, 11.5 kilos of fentanyl powder, and about 41 weapons, 7 vehicles in these 5 states. This
And
was a
see,
big deal.
I tell you, I got to go look this up because like I said, I saw it across the screen or
Mhm.
whatever, but I didn't like stop and really get into it. I had one of those days the last few days. Just haven't really been able to dig into that stuff. But I will tell you this, and I have an article on this. I'm in the process of writing. I'll bring it the next time around, and that is this. This is all part of the geopolitical war strategy. You heard us talk about
Yes.
asymmetrical war. So the Chinese are doing this on purpose. They're working with the cartels to supply them with the baseline products necessary to produce fentanyl to inject it in our country, knowing they will kill off a ton of military-aged people and weaken the United States from within. This is the thing we talked earlier about. You have to have the capacity to think the unthinkable. These evil people think the unthinkable all the time. And if you know a little bit about history, you'll know it ain't the first time. In fact, I was looking at this like the other day. If you may have heard of the Opium Wars, if you're interested in the history of China, then you got to know a little bit about the Opium Wars. Basically, short version of the story, the British sold opium into China to weaken it from within so they could force trade in China. That's how that rolled. So the Chinese are like, I would take the same playbook and throw it back at the United States. Rarely does history not repeat itself in some way, shape, or form. And this is what the Chinese are doing. It's a brilliant strategy, especially when aligned with evil communists that run our government. They want to enforce the border. Um, we all know this is easily fixed. Enforce the border and put people in jail. But you got to have the will. You got to have the will to do it.
You do. So the good news is the person that they got in Oregon is in the hands of the US Marshals. They're not in the county jail any
Yes.
longer. That's
Right.
the good news because I fear that type of thing, with how Oregon is. And
Or you
so
can give them a couple of months in jail.
they would be releasing them soon. I hate to say it, it's
you,
sad but
you,
true. And
and this is such a great side story. I just had to mention it. Did you catch that Trump mentioned reopening Alcatraz?
yes,
I thought that was great.
yes,
He floats more balloons out there, and it makes the left lose their minds,
he does. He does. He trolls him so good.
right?
He
So
does.
who doesn't pump their fist at the thought? If you haven't visited Alcatraz, you're pumping your fist on that one. That's a great idea.
Yes, it's only, I think only 3 people escaped from that place.
Yeah, yeah,
And,
and we,
so yeah, I'd say reopen Alcatraz. I love it.
I
And that's a troll on the judges going, you can't deport anybody. Oh yeah, we can.
we could
And
deport them to Alcatraz.
yeah,
The only drawback with the tourists would lose out, but other than that, great idea.
yes, it is. Yes, it is.
You know, and I
So
felt
hey,
like, go ahead. Go, I'm sorry, go ahead.
go ahead. Nope.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, we'd really be remiss if we didn't talk a little about this stuff that Secretary Kennedy's been finding, with regard to what's going on. I'm going to see if I can pull up an article on that too, because it's absolutely fascinating on this whole vaccine thing that's going on.
Yes.
And I mean, it's just now. I thought I knew a little bit about medicine and testing, and because I came from the drug industry, right? But that's different than the vaccine industry. That's a whole different animal. When you wait till you see how
He
differently
means pharmaceutical, not,
pharmaceutical,
illicit drugs.
yeah, no, no, yeah, yeah, legal and ethical drugs. I have to be clear. So you have to see this to believe it. I mean, I thought I'd seen everything, and it's always like this. Let me see if I can pull this up. So here's an article. Okay, let's speak to it a little bit. Were you aware that drug vaccines are not? I'll read this. Every other drug is required to be tested against at least placebo, except vaccines. In other words, they're not even tested against placebo. You can't even get your head around it. You can't believe it. They just like put them on the market and they're completely untested. And I'm not even talking about the COVID vaccine. I'm talking about like regular vaccines. And my wife and I have been talking about this for a long time. Something different's going on. These aren't the same vaccines we got as kids. They
No.
don't even bother testing these things. They don't test them for efficacy. They don't test them for safety. They don't test them for anything. What they do is they test them against each other. Well, if the drug is tested against, was never tested against a placebo, was never tested for efficacy, was never tested for safety, guess what? You have no idea what that thing is doing. And then you wonder why we got all these like weird diseases popping up all of a sudden, right? In the last few, and it's undeniable.
Yeah.
When I was a kid, I can't think of anybody I knew that was autistic. I mean,
No.
not a single person. There were a couple of kids who had what do you call it, Down syndrome, but of course we kill them, so we don't. So that's not an issue anymore. Not the best solution, but that's what they do. But that's it. Now, I want to say in the early '90s, it started popping up. It's like every other kid, it seems like has got this. Something's different, and I'm so glad that they're finally researching it.
Well, so am I. So let's talk efficacy a minute, because anytime my physician has said, Sonny, you ought to get this shot, my first question is, what's the efficacy?
Right.
So how do they come up with that? It's pie in the sky. They're testing it from something from another shot because they didn't do any placebo tests. And I've not been an anti-vaxxer by any means, but I always ask questions. And if it makes sense to me, then I've had something. And if it doesn't make sense to me, then I don't have it. And I can think of a few that I said no to. I can think of several actually that I said no to, but I've had plenty because of my travels to foreign countries. And so yeah, it's scary. And I'm just so pleased with what RFK Jr. is doing.
Yeah, you weren't even allowed to ask the question. Maybe they'd raise whenever somebody starts calling you names for asking the question. Remember we talked about that old question. Does that make sense? What was the Shakespearean thing? Thou dost protestest too much, right?
Right.
If it was no big deal, why are you crying so loud? I mean, every other drug in the world gets tested except this stuff. And
Yeah.
I was in the military. I got like every jab in the world, back in like the mid '80s, and I didn't have any issues. Um, I do think there were different things they were using then, but really, does it make sense to give somebody like 10 shots at one time? That seems
Right.
a little crazy, particularly babies. I mean, I was like a grown man by the time that happened, but babies. And this article I just forwarded, this last article from RFK Jr., saying they're seeing children start experiencing symptoms of autism shortly after vaccination. What
Yes.
the heck is that about? And we just
Yes.
keep doing it? Um,
Well,
yeah,
like you said, we haven't been able to have the honest conversation. And now they're going to be putting data together. And I think it's going to be true data, I hope, studying Medicare and Medicaid records and things like this. And he's putting this back to, and Dr. Bhattacharya, he's putting us back to the gold standard of science. Let's really have science, and science tests, and having placebo things. And I'll tell you, when I was speaking about the vaccine, I was trying to think of which vaccine was that latest, the other one, not the latest one, but it was the shingles shot. I
Hmm.
remember talking to the doctor about the shingle shot. He says, you ought to get that. Well, the first time he talked to me, there was only one shot. I
Hmm.
didn't take it. I asked the question, efficacy. And he says, well, I said, what's the population that gets shingles? Well, 30% of the population that ever had chickenpox gets shingles. That's 30% of the population. So 70% chance you're never even going to get it. Then of those 30%, the shingle shot, don't quote me on this, I'm not a doctor.
Hmm.
Of that 30%, the shingle shot was good for like 30% of the people um, would not get shingles then. I'm going, well, this is pretty low odds. I think I'll pass. Well, then a few years later, it was a two shot situation for shingles. And I asked the same thing. I said, well, I passed on the first one. And it was basically the same thing. He goes, well, this one it actually works for more people that would be susceptible to have shingles. And I said, okay, well, thanks. And I passed on that one too, because shingles is not going to kill you. Shingles is actually curable if the doctor will give you an antiviral
Hmm.
medication. And so I've educated myself to know, and I don't want it, but at the same time, I'm not going to have a shot for a
Plus, yeah,
very little tiny margin of possibly it won't let me get it.
yeah, and it just doesn't. See, this again, that's great. That's a great example of using your own mind. It doesn't pass the smell test to me. I mean, one thing for me, I hear that 70% get shingles. I have not seen that in my lived experience. I mean, I'm around a lot of old people. 70% of them don't have shingles. I don't believe you, doctor.
Yeah.
I think you're a shill for some pharmaceutical company or whoever's pushing that stuff to make money. And one of the things you never get told is a lot of times the doctor or the company he works for is getting bonuses for this stuff. Now, I
Hmm.
know that because I worked inside of it. I saw the bonus reports they get. The average person in the public doesn't understand this or know this. The days of Marcus Welby, MD, are gone, baby. You better caveat emptor on these people and not be trusting
Yeah.
everything they tell you. I remember when the chickenpox thing came down, and my kids were small, and they started pushing that. Well, what's the benefit of this? Well, we have no long term data. That's the first thing. This is one of these businesses where you don't want to
Yes.
be the new person. Like when a new car comes out, a new car design, you want to wait till 3 or 4 iterations have been out. Don't be the first person and you get the lemon. Well, this
Yes.
is a little more important than a car purchase, right? So that's the first thing you got to be thinking. You got no data. And then the second thing is we're talking mere convenience. So my kid gets chicken pox and they're out for like, 3 or 4 days and our lives are disrupted for 3 or 4 days. And then they're immune for life versus you get this shot, and then 25, 30 years goes by and they start finding all kinds of issues with it. Or you got to get the shot again and again and again. And we have no data to know what multiple shots will do. I'm
Yes.
just a believer in the body's immune system. Do no harm is the first thing I think it was Hippocrates said. And your body will heal to the degree that you can. You want it to heal itself. And a lot of times it's just lifestyle choices and what we put in our bodies and how much stress we have. That's the stuff that needs to be managed first. Now, I get it. There are things where you get cancer, it is what it is, right? But for a lot of this stuff,
Yeah.
I
Yes, and there's a good meme out there that I have seen on X that shows the cartoon of the 60s and 70s, of Harriet saying to George, calling him, honey, I wanted to let you know the kids came home, they've got the measles today, or the chicken pox today.
yeah.
No big deal. Okay, we're having a chicken pox party, right? And you invite the
Yeah.
neighbor kids, you get it all, you want it when they're young.
Mhm.
Versus today, the other cartoon is Harriet calling George, oh my God, they've got the chicken pox or what, the hysteria with it. And
Yeah.
it's been a childhood disease. And I've seen somebody who had it as an adult look pretty miserable. But you
Mhm.
know what? You did survive.
Yeah.
Very,
Well,
very, very, very few people actually died of those illnesses.
Well, people are hysterical even about like the common cold anymore. Are you kidding me? It's
Yeah.
like, hey, guess what? People get runny noses. It happens, and they get over it. And it's probably good that you get one once a year just to test that immune system. I do think there's going to be some blowback associated with just being overly crazy about being overly clean, right? Overly hand washed, overly masked, overly all of that stuff. Because if you don't get something once in a while, that's not good either. That doesn't mean you let yourself be deathly ill, but you get something, you go home and you sleep and you drink a bunch of water, and a day or two later, you're good to go.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yes, we do have an immune system for a reason, and I'll tell you, it's this banning. We're talking about illnesses, and Trump banned. He says we're not funding gain of function research anymore. It's not allowed. He signed an executive order on that,
mhm.
and I think it's fabulous. So in my mind, I wonder, did chickenpox come from that? I
Yeah,
haven't any idea,
yeah,
because gain of function research, this type of research, has been going on for a long time. And sadly, more countries are doing this now. And so I'm very pleased that Trump says, we're not paying for this. We're not doing it in America, and we're not paying for it anywhere else either. Our dollar, the buck stops, and it's just stopping here in America. I'm so
yeah.
glad.
Well, we just experienced what the radical left has thought for a long time: a slick way to control the population was to get control of healthcare. So one of the reasons why they want to have a government-imposed healthcare system, because once we have that, then they can freak people out into doing exactly what they want to do and claim it's in the name of safety or trust the science. We all know
Yeah.
what that means, right? And they just tried to pull that off with this whole COVID crisis. And those of us who had a brain saw through it pretty quickly. The rest of us had to get punched in the face, as is usually the case. But that's a pretty ugly price to pay.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Well, they were running, fast tracking the globalist agenda, and now it's falling apart. Thank God. Thanks be to God for that.
Absolutely.
When Klaus Schwab resigned and he says globalism is dead, they might have put another person at the head of the WEF, but it's done.
Yeah.
It
Well,
is, and we have to be vigilant. We have to continue fighting for our freedoms, the freedoms of speech, freedom of choice, freedom of medical, um, freedoms everywhere. But we have a constitution in the United States that we've got to protect at any cost. We have to protect it and uphold our rights.
Well, one thing we have to recognize is that the evil will always be among us. We win one war, and it'll remorph into some other form. Just like when the Soviet Union collapsed, and everybody thought that was well, that was going to be the end, and here we find ourselves in a essentially an asymmetrical World War III. The World War One, the big claim was, hey, it's the war to end all wars. Where were we 20 years later? Bombing Pearl Harbor and Stalingrad, right? So
Yes.
this is just the nature of man. Truth be told, we are always at war. It's just a question of whether it's going to be a kinetic war where we're actually shooting each other, or it's going to be a war of ideas. And we're constantly in a war of ideas. And if we don't promulgate or figure out a way to better transmit these ideas to our youth, this is a whole nother, topic, of course, because now I'm about to bomb the public school system, of course. If we don't transmit those ideas to them, then how will they know what they're defending in the first place? A lot of the
Yeah.
reasons we're in the trouble we are now is because they don't know their national story. Um, they don't know the Declaration of Independence. They don't know the Gettysburg Address. They don't know, four score and 7 years ago. They don't know any of that stuff that in our age group is common knowledge because we were taught that. They don't say the Pledge of Allegiance. They don't say sing my country tis of thee. None of that stuff. And we got to find a way to get that back. Or winning now, that's nice, but we're going to be gone in 30 or 40 years. And if those guys don't know this stuff, this is all for naught.
Absolutely. Hey, so I want to touch on one thing before we close, Don. I'm going to post another article here, And that is for those of you getting on an airplane, the real ID did go in force today.
Hmm.
So you need to have a real ID or a passport card. And this article out of the Epoch Times is saying that um, the real ID has actually gone into full effect today at all US airports. And it's in full enforcement of the law that people who show IDs that are not compliant, that don't have one, they will receive a warning and will be sent to a separate area to undergo more screening from the TSA. So the you need to either get a passport or have a passport card or get the real ID. And I didn't realize until I heard it. I read it somewhere recently. That law was passed 20 years ago. So it was after 9/11. It was after 9/11 that they passed this law that you must have, a real ID to get on an airplane. And it's finally here.
Well, it's like the government, it's slightly late, but they did get around to it. It's kind of like the DMV, you go get in line and eventually it will get to you.
Eventually, yes.
Well, hey, Sonny, we're kind of getting close to the top of that hour. What do you think? I should want to mention this one last thing. This whole thing about the Pope, right? So, of course, the conclave is formed. Black smoke came out today. We're still waiting. But the one, and this is one more, tag on the whole China thing. They have required that they select the bishops and the priests and that sort of thing in China, which is another thing that communists do all the time. And this last pope, like, just let that roll. So it'd be very interesting to see what the next one does. And I'll just leave it at that.
It is going to be interesting to see, and I think a lot of conservative Catholics have been dismayed by the last pope, and I think they're looking forward to a conservative one. So we'll see, because I think if the Catholic Church, personally, I'm not a Catholic, but I think if the Catholic Church wants to really survive, they need to follow the teachings instead of kind of making it, well, we'll just give in to this. You know what I mean? It's sort of like there's people that say our Constitution is fluid. It can change with the times. Well, no, the Constitution is what it is
Yeah,
until it's amended.
yeah, and yeah, it's
And I
100%
feel that the
true.
Bible teachings are that way as well. And they've kind of just going with the flow of the times,
Mhm.
that, well, yeah, we're going to have transgenders of everything and whatnot, and anything goes.
There's uh, what a lot you hear in Christianity is you hear about the nice and good and the loving and all that part, but you never hear about this other side of it. That's called the justice side. Yes, there's a heaven, but guess what? There's a hell too, and here's how you get there. And that's the part people don't want to hear, and they just have to hear it. It's pretty clear cut, right? Didn't say it was easy, but it is clear
Right.
cut. So, anyways,
Yes, you're right. So, hey, I've got one more good news. The Supreme Court lets the military ban troops who identify as transgender.
yes.
We're winning. We're winning, Don.
We are. And these culture war things, they're hugely important. The economic things, the military things, I mean, all of those. But these cultural things are so important. Another one of those same lines was Trump proclaiming Columbus Day. That was another one. We could spend a whole hour talking about just that. But yes, those things matter. And I'm so glad, Mount McKinley being Mount McKinley again, the Gulf of
Yes.
Mexico being the Gulf of America. I mean, those things matter a lot. So I'm so glad you brought that up.
Well, I'm reading this comment that Lori Good posted. Wow, Boise voted to make the LGBTQ flag a city flag so they don't have to remove it.
So Boise voted that.
Boise City.
See,
Boise
so here's the
City.
thing: it's a strategy of the radicals. They identify conservative towns, and they're paid to move there and get on these city councils and vote for this stuff. I don't believe the citizens of Boise vote for that stuff, right? That's probably some,
No, and I bet you they get a bunch of blowback.
yeah,
And so the citizens and the city of Boise, you better get to the next city council and
yeah.
reverse it.
Yep, you're going to have to. All politics is local, as they say. And
It
one thing the
is.
radical left does is they're very good at this stuff, destroying us, gutting us out locally. So while you're at work and trying to raise your kids and pay the taxes, they're taking your tax money and hosing you down. And we're going to have to get like them. That's just the way it is.
It is the way it is. And speaking of voting, here in Oregon, we have until May 20th to get your ballot in. And this is all local positions. The ballot that you've received is all local stuff, and it's important that everybody vote. Get the ballot off the kitchen counter. If you don't know who to vote for, talk to your family, friends, or neighbors, and or get a hold of your local political party, your county party, and ask them, hey, anybody about these people, anything about some of these that are running, because
Mhm.
it's important to vote.
Yeah, absolutely. Keep voting, keep fighting.
Yes. Thanks for posting that article, Lori. We appreciate it. We appreciate our audience and the feedback very much. Like and share everywhere. Tell everybody about our show. And here we go. Yes, we need conservative school boards.
Yes,
Absolutely.
100%. Maybe the most important thing we need is that.
Yes. Thank
All
you,
right.
everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Really enjoy you all. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a wonderful Wednesday.
Good
Good night.
night.
Oops. Um,